for the beginning, I would like to say that 2021 is a very particular year, which I think will go down into history because of its controversy. It's a year when we will learn about carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's a year when Europe will adopt or start adopting another package after clean energy package. This will be Fit for 55, which of course will have reflection in energy community as well. Everything with some delay comes to us as well. It's a year when prices of CO2 emissions are historically high, but it's also a year, this is why I'm talking about controversies, when we can observe increased generation of electricity from coal power plants in energy community contracting parties. The price difference between zero costs for CO2 emissions in energy community and, let's say, 50 euros per ton in European Union made this business extremely profitable. This, of course, cannot last forever, but recently I read some days ago an interview with a Chinese investor who is now interested to build another coal power plant in Bosnia and Herzegovina, very close to Croatian border. He said, this is now so profitable market, we have to be there. And it's true, we can see record high profits of many traders with electricity because they are using this opportunity. This, as I said, it cannot last long, but it will last, could be for some years. And this is a very special occasion when, if it will be missed, we will somehow miss energy community contracting parties from EU vehicle or boat. I won't say forever, because never ever say forever, but for a very long time, because the differences are getting so big, and these differences are should be overcome, of course, not only with policy measures, but also with financial measures. And earning money out of coal, currently being having this as a so profitable activity, should be definitely channeled into bigger efforts or deeper efforts for transition. As I said, there are financial measures, but also policy and legal measures. Energy community is organization based on the rule of law. We are sometimes saying we are exporting European law into contracting parties. But of course, it's more than that, but in a very basic meaning is as it is. And our contracting parties are hardly coping with old acquis, let's say large combustion plants directive, which is even not relevant in European Union anymore. It is kind of a fossil, but a good fossil, which still has an impact in energy community. It's the only legal obligation which our contracting parties have to respect when lowering emissions. But new laws are coming. This year, a third energy package will come on our ministerial council and become legal obligation. I very much hope emission trading scheme directive will be proposed by Commission sooner than later to have it as a legal framework. 2030 targets were first time discussed on our ministerial council back in 2017. They were still not proposed. And here I'm coming to one chapter of this study, which I find particularly interesting, and these are climate laws. European Union just adopted its own climate law, which is of course, untransposable into energy community because it addresses things that are not in place yet in energy community. It's more kind of a governance law. But this study explored content of climate laws around the world. And this is a very rich, I would say, niche, if I can use it, if I can use that word, because there is no unique or unified definition what climate law is. And this we can see also in our contracting parties. Some of them, 3 of them, already adopted climate laws, Albania, Serbia, Montenegro, but the content is quite different. And in 2 countries, it is mostly about MRV regulation, transposition, registers of CO2 emissions and such things. In Montenegro, they introduced into climate law also elements of emission trading scheme directive. And Montenegro is the only contracting party which already has CO2 price 24 euros per ton. This is something where I think what offers to us, let's say people from technical assistance, to European Union, to NGOs, and to our authorities of our contracting parties, a possibility to be innovative, to design things that can be relatively easily reinvented and, of course, adopted. Because if we wait on European acquis, this can last quite long, but climate laws can be done much faster. Not to be too long and not to start boring everybody, I will leave it there. I would just like to say that we are happy to have such studies. They help us in our everyday life and efforts for energy transition. And of course, happy to merge our forces with the authors and Green Policy Center and European Climate Foundation, like many times in the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Kopac, for your kind words. And sorry, I forgot to mention 2 things. First of all, to introduce myself, my name is Gage Dudashaiver for the European Climate Foundation, and you can find my contact details in the press release, which we will send you along with the recording of this press conference. So while I'm stating that, that also means that I should inform you all that this press conference is being recorded. I hope you don't have any kind of problem with that. And now we have József Feiler, the regional director of ECF, to have his endorsement of the study. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here, although it's Friday morning, but the rain is coming after the heat wave in Budapest. I guess it's the same in the region as well. I'm privileged to be here because this study marks a long process to start, at least in our sense, in the region. Getting to carbon neutrality is a bit farther reaching than getting to 2030 targets, which was already discussed in the energy community context by the contracting parties from the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova. What we see here is, and why we are really pushing beyond our general mandate, is to have a structured, well-designed process in the countries of the Western Balkans to engage in the long process, which is not an easy process to get to carbon neutrality. It's unavoidable to get there. So it's not to be debated that there is climate change or not, or whether you need to act or not. It's just the matter how you do it. And there are 2 ways for the countries. One is to do it on the hard way, so not to plan it, not to prepare it, and being pushed to do it. Well, being pushed to do it will be done by Mother Nature, because climate change is already hitting, and also the whole business and political environment around the globe is changing. So it will be hardly possible to avoid dealing with it. The later the countries start to engage, and not just engagement in words like the Sofia Declaration, which is very much commended, but although in planning and implementing changes is saving a lot of money. So it is also saving a lot of problem for people on the ground in the country, citizens, but also for governments and businesses. So the later you start, the more expensive, although there might be short-term gains visible now, like Janez mentioned on coal-based electricity generation, but it will fire back. We see that coal-based generation is pretty much gone by 2030 in the EU countries, and I assume, and actually I am ready to bet that by 2030 most of the coal-based electricity generation will be gone in the Western Balkan countries as well. It's a very fast process, which is hard to foresee, at least unless you deal with the underlying conditions, but then it accelerates. We see it in Romania and Bulgaria, how authorities are dealing with being late. And this is the point where I really would like to stop, because I think the authors can tell more about the framework conditions, what has to be set for the transition. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And now, after just this 50 minutes of introductions, we actually will start the presentations on the study itself. We will have two presentations. First, we have Mr. Predrag Momčilović from the Belgrade University, a climate expert who co-authored the study. And after that, as I mentioned, András Huszár.
Predrag, I suggest you start.
Yeah, I think we lost Jörgedi. Hello from Belgrade, and it's actually interesting to present my conclusion here, because during the last week we had every day in Belgrade over 37 or 38 degrees, and 2 weeks ago we had hottest day ever in June. And now I will talk a little bit, because I contribute to one part of this study, and what will happen if we don't introduce any carbon neutrality measures, and what will happen in contracting parties like in Western Balkan countries, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, if temperature continue to rise and greenhouse emission continue to rise. And in this chapter in which I contribute, we looked at scientific prediction on what can happen if in short, medium and long term, if carbon neutrality measures are not applying. From the analysis of impact of climate change in temperature, precipitation regime, impact on forestry and agriculture, water resources, health and social consequences, as I mentioned, as a result of non-implementation of carbon neutrality measures. And what will happen with temperature? Yeah, temperature will continue to increasing, and for example, for the period of the end of the century in Western Balkan countries, in the case of constant global increase of greenhouse emission, the expected temperature will rise and reach between 4 and 5 Celsius degrees in whole region, in related to current climate. In particular, temperature will rise during the summer months like June, July and August, which will exceed 5 Celsius degree compared to today, and only slightly smaller increase in temperature can be expected only in northern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia. And similar situation it's also for Moldova, where until end of the century we can expect increase in temperature from 4 to 5 Celsius degrees. And in Ukraine, it's a little bit different because large territory size, but also scientific predictions that the temperature will rise between 1 and 5 Celsius degrees in various parts of the country by 2100, and mostly the winter and spring months will become warmer, and some researchers believe that the tropical climate will reach Moldova and Ukraine, and that the subtropical zone already presented in both countries will expand further, and also temperature will rise in Georgia, but also Georgia we can separate on western and eastern parts, and in western parts it's expected that temperature will increase on 3.5 degrees, and in eastern parts like 4.1, and all these things will impact on precipitation, and they will be divided, and in some regions it will decrease, but in some it will increase, but it will be different in different zones. The impact of climate change is visible in the change of annual distribution of precipitation, which it's noticeable from the pronounced dry summer, and we will have even more dry summer in June, July, and August, and also will impact that during the winter we will have more water, and which can affect that we'll have more floods which are expected during the winter season. And for example, for Ukraine, it's expected more droughts during the summer months, and already we have like 10 to 30% more droughts than in period between 1990 and 2010, and in future we can expect more and more, and which will take much bigger territories. And when we talk about water resources, global warming will lead to change in water cycle, which will probably affect the availability of the water in different scales and sectors like energy sector, agriculture, forestry, and other. And for Western Balkan area, water availability is expected to decrease during the summer months, and annual river flow could be reduced by more than 45% by 2021 in world warmer by 4 Celsius degrees. As temperature rise, water supplies requirement will also increase, especially during the summer, and long-term projections show that water availability will decrease and water quality will deteriorate, which will worsen sanitary and hygienical conditions, especially in rural communities, and this could lead to growing gap between water needs and water availability. And it will affect all contracting parties from Western Balkans countries to Georgia, and also will affect agriculture and forestry. And agricultural production could suffer significantly losses by the end of the century if appropriate adjustment measures are not taken. For example, for Western Balkan project, climate change could lead to total corn yield losses by approximately 52% by end of the country. and increasing number of invasive species of plants and animals is expected with change of climate conditions. The spread of pests and disease in some of the most important crops, such maize, sugar beet, orchard, can lead to significant economical losses, and especially will affect small farmers and rural households. And also climate change will affect pretty much economy of Moldova, which are based like almost 10 to 15% of GDP of Moldova. It's coming from agriculture production. And it's predicted to have a negative impact on production of wheat, which is most important plant which is produced in Moldova, and also on wine production. And by the middle of century, due to the climate change, wheat production in Moldova could fall by 41%, corn by 52%, and sunflower by 13%. And if we're going to end of the century, it can be even higher. And I will tell just a little bit more about health and social consequences, and I will finish there. And climate change and raising temperature could create favorable conditions for the outbreak of vector-borne disease like malaria, dengue, West Nile virus. Already we have in Western Balkan region, we have already some of this disease, and they can be more and more often. They are already, and they will increase in the future, and also rising of temperature and climate change will affect on the migration. Although the climate specific factors are often difficult to isolate from other environmental challenges, evidence suggests that climate change is already driving increasing population movement within and across the borders, and displacement due to the climate change often occurs as a result of factors as such increasing extremely weathers and sea level rising and accelerating of environmental degradation. And for example, in 2018, we had 17.2 million displaced people linked to climate catastrophe were recorded in 148 countries and territories. And for Western Balkan countries, have had already likely to continue and to have frequent consequences of global population displacement, and we are witnesses of big like migration crisis in Western Balkan countries already, and will continue this domestic and across the border migration in a future while climate is changing. And I will stop now, and you can have questions later.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. And I will just say that before András starts his presentation on the actual policy solutions which can and which should help us to cure our climate, or at least trying to act on those all those dangers Predrag just mentioned. So I think I can say on behalf of the organizer Green Policy Center here that we are very happy to see so many people. We are very happy to see so many journalists, and also happy to see so many colleagues from different organizations, from the contracting parties, NGOs, officers. But I would like to ask that as after the presentations, please leave the floor for questions for the journalists. Thank you so much for that. And of course, feel free, that goes for everybody, feel free to reach out to us after the presentations and feel free to reach out to the Green Policy Center. And now, András, let's hear about those policy solutions which can help us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gergely. I hope everyone can hear me well and see me as well. Let me echo what Gergely has said. And on behalf of the Green Policy Center, I also welcome everyone who sacrificed his Friday morning to us and to this presentation. Let me also thanks to the Energy Community Secretariat for supporting us, and obviously the European Climate Foundation for financing this report. I'm really sorry about the lights and the possible sounds from outside, but a huge storm is approaching. So I hope my presentation will not be affected too much by that. I hope you can also see my presentation. Obviously this is a 40+ page long study, so I can only give you a short summary on the main conclusions, main points of the study. You already received the full study, and obviously it will be available on our website as well, so you can read everything. And as Gergely said, you will also have the opportunity to ask questions from the authors of the study, including me. So let's see. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but please switch to presentation mode. I think it's going to be much easier to see. Thanks.
I will try to do that. Is it better now?
Yeah, thanks. That's perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, so let's see what topics will be discussed in this 15 minutes presentation. So I will talk about the general starting points in terms of the international and EU policy area. I will talk about the connections to the EU ambition and its possible aspects, the externalities and co-benefits of climate neutrality, the economic benefits of ambitious targets, and finally some best practices from national climate laws and good practices for setting up long-term strategies, which is not the same, but I will talk about that later. So let's start with the starting points. What else can be other than the Paris Agreement? I think I'm a lawyer by profession, and climate neutrality as a word is not included in the Paris Agreement, but there is a legal expectation, I would say, in the Paris Agreement that by the second half of this century, parties to the Paris Agreement will aim to reach a balance between emissions and sinks, and this is what's called, in short, climate neutrality. So I usually argue that climate neutrality is embedded in the Paris Agreement, and it is a legal expectation and under international law. The global climate neutrality goal, I would also argue it's indirectly a national climate neutrality goal to every party to the Paris Agreement, because it would be really difficult to imagine how global climate neutrality could be achieved if not every single party would go climate neutral individually. Climate neutrality also puts short and medium-term national action into perspective. Basically, in other words, it gives meaning to our climate efforts. So we are not aiming to reach XYZ emission reduction by 2030, 2040, etc. We would like to reach climate neutrality in the end, and that's the bottom line. And basically, that's what it makes climate policy meaningful, I would say, and that's how you can start to plan backwards. Because if you know the ultimate goal, which is climate neutrality, you can make the models how to get there, etc. So we have a very solid endpoint, or at least a very, very important milestone in international climate efforts. Obviously, we also have the IPCC special report issued in October 2018. And I would say by issuing this report, which basically said in very simple words that if we don't reach global climate neutrality by 2050, so basically the first point of the second half of this century, we will not be able to keep a global temperature rise under 1.5 degrees, and it will have devastating consequences even compared to a 2 degrees world. So since the publication of the IPCC report, there's a growing number of 2050 pledges, climate neutrality pledges worldwide. And this is also true, thankfully, now for the contracting parties of the energy community, because a Sofia Declaration was adopted last year, which basically says that the signing parties of that declaration is aiming to reach climate neutrality by 2050 as well. However, these are all nice goals and nice words and nice expectations, but concrete action is needed. And as I usually say, we have entered into the era of implementation. So we know where we would like to be in 20, 30 years' time. And now it is time to adopt underpinning legislation and strategies at the national level and maybe regional level, etc. But the bottom line is that we need to start to implement these important goals. So what are the connection to the EU ambition and its positive impacts? The EU has declared back in 2019, in the end of 2019, that Europe will be the first climate neutral continent. And the European Commission is currently aligning the EU acquis and policies with this goal. And in summary, we usually say that this all will have a spillover effect on the outside world of the EU, including the contracting parties of the energy community, which obviously have a prominent role and connection with the European Union. So I will not go into the details of these various policy packages and proposals. I'm sure most of you are very well familiar with them. We have the European Green Deal and the European Climate Law. We are expecting that the Fit for 55 package will be issued on the 14th of July. So in 1 week time, roughly. And there will be so many new policy proposals by the European Commission in order to align the EU climate architecture with the new goals, not only climate neutrality, but the updated 2030 target, which is the at least 55% target. We also have an economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans, which was announced last autumn, if I recall well, which will allocate funds for the Western Balkan countries in the areas such as transport, energy, and green transition, in order to, help this region to keep up the pace with the green transition of the European Union. The European Union is also aiming for greening of the investments, and obviously it will probably have a spillover effect as well on the energy community contracting parties. And last but not least, as Mr. Kopac mentioned, the EU is fighting very seriously against carbon leakage, which will have maybe the most direct effect on the outside world of the EU. The Fit for 55 package will include a proposal on the establishment of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Basically, some kind of fines will be imposed on imported fossil fuel and heavy emission intensive products coming into the EU, which obviously will affect in one way or the other the contracting parties as well. Let me give you some externalities and co-benefits of climate neutrality, because it's important to see why we are doing all of this. It's not only about the climate. Obviously, there are several additional co-benefits, such as environmental, health, and social as well. We all know that air quality is a huge problem in the region, and it has a huge direct effect on people's health. So basically, reducing fossil fuel intensive emissions would reduce significantly the cost of illnesses, etc., in the region. So I think it speaks for itself. The decarbonization of the currently used energy systems could provide huge savings if you phase out fossil fuel subsidies, for instance. We gave you a figure on that one. And decarbonization could also lower the import dependency, which basically increases energy security, which I think is a very serious goal. More sustainable agriculture would also have additional co-benefits in terms of lowering mortality, etc. And obviously there are further positive effects on employment, poverty elevation, and inequality. So speaking about the economic benefits of the ambitious targets, let me give you some figures, how diverse is the situation in the region, because if you see, for instance, the per capita emission in the region, it's still lower than the EU average. However, the IMF, based on the data by the IMF, we expect a huge increase in GDP. And this GDP growth should be accompanied by GHG emission reduction. So basically, that's the underlying challenge that we will face. At the same time, in some contracting parties, we see a decreasing emission reduction goals, whereas in other contracting parties, we see even targets which says that they will increase their emissions in the near future. It is also important to mention that there's a high economic price for no action. These are mostly global data, but the point here is that basically, as József also mentioned, that the challenge now is what we face is whether we keep this transition under control, and we will save huge amount of money. Obviously, we need to invest a lot of money, but we will save, on the other hand, huge amount of money. Or this process will be uncontrolled after some time because Mother Nature will enforce us to do things differently than we are doing now. We also argue in the study that carbon neutrality is a way to ensure the right to development of developing countries. And also, at the same time, it's basically the only opportunity for a sustainable future, because if we don't aim for climate neutrality, the future processes will be uncontrolled, which means obviously that there will be huge differences from one year to the other in terms of economic processes, in terms of lifestyle patterns, etc. So we argue that the controlled and a sustainable future lies ahead in the direction of carbon neutrality. Now, obviously, there's a high risk of stranded assets in the region, for instance, which should be mentioned among the most important ones. You see that 95 of the power plants in Southeastern Europe region needs to be replaced by 2050, but at the same time, there's still 2.5 billion euro subsidies to coal-sourced electricity gas pipe and the gas pipeline lifespan, which is 30, 50 years. So basically, if you invest this money into these heavily polluting industry, it will have consequences in the long-term future. And basically, these investments will never return to the investors. Last but not least, we also mentioned what are the most significant mitigation potential in the region. We see three areas: energy, transport, and waste. I think we can talk about that later. And now coming on the best practices of the national and European climate laws. Our study was obviously based on the available literature about that. And we tried to summarize the most important points available in the literature. Obviously, we have the new EU climate law, which says that the Union will be climate neutral by 2050 and net negative thereafter. So basically, the EU goes even beyond the expectation of the Paris Agreement and says that it will be net negative after 2050. But the underlining point here is that climate neutrality goal will be a central part of every subsequent EU legislative proposal, which at the same time will have a spillover effect, as I mentioned before, on the energy community as well. The EU climate law also includes key elements of an effective climate governance regime, which I will talk about later. With regards to national level climate laws, There are a growing number worldwide. We focused only European EU member states best practices mainly, but they are very useful sources to identify best practices, because the bottom line here is that we don't have to invent hot water. So we first, when we try to formulate a national climate law, we need to see what's already in place and what are the best practices, what is working, what is not that well. Obviously, it does not guarantee that if something is working in one country, it will work in the other one. But there are, I think, those kind of best practices which can be said that they're more or less for sure needs to be included in an effective climate legislation. I will talk about the most important aspects which we identified that needs to be included in an adequate climate legislation. The first one, obviously, is goals. You need to have very clear targets and also milestones, because if you have a climate neutrality target by 2050 now, but you don't have any interim targets by 2030, by 2040, you will lose sight where you are actually going, whether you are actually going to the right direction. So you need to pose also milestones. And that's what I was mentioning before, that climate neutrality presupposes a backward planning process. So basically, you will have to plan backwards from the goal of climate neutrality. Planning and measures. This is a very serious task. You need to undertake a comprehensive and coordinated planning process, also vertical and horizontal. And you need to break the so-called silo approach. So basically, people need to talk to each other. And this can be done, for instance, by the creation of interministerial coordination bodies, which works relatively well, for instance, in Hungary. You also need to include effective monitoring and revision in your national climate legislation, which provides a solid basis for amending adopted strategies and legislation. And it also increases predictability and continuous recalibration. What about institutional arrangements? Obviously, the most important here is that main responsibilities should be clearly defined. Who is doing what, who is responsible for what, and probably it's also useful to set up independent, previously non-existent institutions, because the challenge is so different from everything else we had before that these kind of institutions can be helpful. Policy science cooperation, it's also extremely important. We ourselves were trying to do it in this very study when we involved Predrag in the beginning. So, all climate-related action needs to be underpinned by scientific evidence, ideally. Obviously, science cannot replace policy making, but it can provide very meaningful inputs, just as the IPCC is giving to the UNFCCC. And last but not least, public participation. We also believe that it's extremely important because climate change affects everyone. So the widest possible awareness raising and involvement should be carried out. And last but not least, I will try to be very brief. What about long-term strategies? Because climate laws and long-term strategies are not exactly the same. What is the difference? Well, first of all, the Paris Agreement contains an expectation to formulate long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies, mid-century strategies, so by 2050. And these strategies by nature are very, more flexible and more comprehensive than a legislation, obviously, because it's not a normative text, it's a strategy. It can include different scenarios, options, etc. And our study divided the best practices into procedural and implementation issues, and on the other hand, substantive issues. Obviously, there are some overlaps with the best practices in climate legislation and best practices in long-term strategies, because there are similarities between the two, but we divided them into two parts in order to make it more clear what is a best practice in terms of legislation and what is a best practice in terms of a long-term strategy. What are the key elements during the formulation and implementation? I would like to highlight very much the first one, which is political and legal commitment. I think if this does not exist, then everything else cannot follow it, because even if you have the best legislation in place, or even if you have, I don't know, the nicest goals on paper, if there's no political and legal commitment in a given country, then this huge endeavor, this 30 years endeavor, cannot be successful. I would really like to underline that. Obviously, just as the national legislation processes, you need to undertake policy coordination. You need to align development goals and well-being priorities with climate targets. This is a very important saying, and this is underpinned by the materials from the OECD, for instance, that in order to ensure that development goals are in line with climate targets, it's very important not to go against each other. So they need to be aligned. You need to have an effective governance system in place in order to effectively implement the strategy. And you also have to have a revision and update cycle included. Finally, the content-related key elements. You need to have a clear long-term vision, which includes also financial and investment. So basically, money is extremely important in this case as well. So you need to have a financial vision, how you would like to finance your goals, and what kind of investments are you trying to achieve. Emission reductions and enhancement of removals. So, I was talking about the balance between emissions and sinks. So you not only have to lower your emissions, but you need to increase your sink capacities as much as possible in order to reach this balance at the most convenient point. I also talked about already the interim milestone targets, which are extremely important. And the fourth point is the linkages with NDCs, SDGs, and other societal national goals, as well as synergies and potential co-benefits. The climate action is not in itself. That should be a known fact. It should be in line and it can support other important processes which are good for the environment and which are good for the society as well. Include national action for just transition. I think it's a very important topic for the contracting parties. Climate action should not mean that many people are losing their jobs. It should be about job creation. It should be about retraining, reskilling workers, etc. And last but not least, pathways are extremely important because they can help to visualize the process. Because climate neutrality goal in itself does not say too much. You need to go down into sectorial levels. You need to dive deep into analysis, and these all should be scientifically sound. This should be based on scientifically sound modeling, ideally, because it can help a lot. I will stop here now. So thank you for your kind attention, and we will be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, András, for this very exciting presentation. So now it's time for journalists to ask their questions. And as I already put it in the chat, I have to warn you that Mr. Kopac will have to leave in just a couple of minutes. So should you have any questions directed to him, please start with those. And as I already also put in the chat, I would ask all colleagues and other officials from different kind of organizations to leave the floor for the journalists for questions. Thank you so much. So is there any questions? You can raise your hand. You can put those questions in writing in the chat box, or you just can start talking right now. But I don't see anyone who would like to start. Until then, I would have a question to András then, and it seems to be it's connected to your very last sentences. It seems to me that it's a very typical argument of the governments in the region that fossil fuels provide jobs and cheap energy, and the countries of the region are just not well enough funded in order to start a transition if they want to provide these so-called benefits. But can this statement or can this argument already clearly refuted, especially as with the EU funds and the technological developments from the recent years? So.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Just a quick reaction. 2 points on that question. First point is I wanted to highlight is that climate action cannot go against society. So social support needs to be ensured along the way. And obviously there will be, transition of the work market, etc., which will have obviously short-term or even medium-term negative consequences for some. But this needs to be planned in advance, and that's the key point. And that's what I was trying to mention or trying to underline in the presentation, that all these processes needs to be under control. And I think, as you mentioned, more and more funds will be available for these countries for these planning processes, I would say. So if you have a great plan which shows where will be the negative impacts concretely, then probably more than likely you will be able to apply for funds in order to prevent those or to handle those negative impacts in a coordinated manner. And that's the underlying message from my side.
Thanks. Anyone else? Do we have questions from the floor? Still no one yet. I should warn you again that this is your last chance to address any questions to Mr. Kopac.
Hi, good morning. Can I ask a question?
Sure, please state your name and the organization you're representing.
My name is...
Are you presenting?
My name is Luka Dimitrov. I'm an energy reporter at ICIS based in London. How impressed is the energy community with North Macedonia phasing out plans to exit coal by 2027, and also all the renewable projects that are happening across the West Balkans, particularly in Albania, wind tenders and the developments of the region? How can EU help those Western Balkan countries to speed up renewable investments and even attract more funding for those projects? Thank you. To both.
I'm going to try to briefly answer. Despite we are sometimes critical, a lot is happening in Western Balkans and also in Ukraine related to renewables. 3 countries, North Macedonia, Albania, and Serbia, changed their laws and introduced auctions for renewable support. And the same approach they have in Montenegro. Kosovo is preparing changes of the legislation which will allow to cancel feed-in tariffs. Bosnia and Herzegovina is, as usually, a little bit behind. Feed-in tariffs currently prevent new investments into renewables because they are so costly that the governments do not wish to raise the quotas. This, of course, should be then reflected on the electricity bill, and they're afraid of this. Renewables are now anyhow so cheap, new technologies are so cheap that in many cases you don't need any special stimulus. But there are many other things which prevent more investments. One of them is non-existence of day-ahead market. Only Serbia has day-ahead market. Montenegro, Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia are preparing it right now. If we will be lucky, it will happen in a year. And Bosnia and Herzegovina again behind. The second thing which is needed, let's say I'm talking about not financial support, but about legal infrastructure, which is urgently necessary to have to boost investments into renewables. Second thing is allocation of cross-border capacities. The Western Balkans, ex-former Yugoslavia, is extremely well interconnected physically. And these capacities are underutilized. We made a study and showed that they are utilized less than 30%. In European Union, more than at least 70% of capacities have to be obligatory offered to traders for utilization. This electricity regulation has to be proposed by European Commission to our Ministerial Council, and then it will become obligatory as well. This has not happened yet, but this is the lowest hanging fruit. So there is plenty of opportunities to enhance the electricity trade inside the region. And this is needed for renewables investors to have more chances, not to be locked on national markets. Next thing which is preventing renewables investments are state aid to coal electricity. There are two countries, Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they give more cash out of budget for coal-based electricity generation than for feed-in tariffs for renewables. That's very controversial. And this state aid is usually, according to our assessment, Secretariat's assessment, non-compliant, and so on and so on. There are many other issues. So behind or beyond, I would say, direct financial stimulus for renewables investments that are needed and that are really low-hanging fruit. I mean, what is easier than to stop paying cash out of budget for coal-based generation? But action is missing. You mentioned North Macedonia and support of European Union. Last year, Commission adopted so-called energy and investment plan for Western Balkans, and this offers 9 billion euros for different projects in transport, in energy, in many sectors. And it is on countries to decide where they will try to get some money for co-financing of their projects. As far as I know, but this is really unofficially, North Macedonia, for example, opted for co-financing of railway between Skopje and Sofia, but also expressed an interest to get a portion of this 9 billion euros for co-financing of big solar power plants, which would be managed by state-owned electricity incumbent, Electro Severna Macedonia. And okay, this is, I mean, investments into renewables could be solely market-based, but if North Macedonia will opt for this, I think through the financial mechanism, which is called Western Balkans Investment Framework, investments into renewables could be co-financed up to 20%. This, I'm not completely sure. I think it is like that. And then they could get this up to 20% for these big investments. The government has some sites. One of them was previously envisaged for a logistical center. It's in a very central place in Northern Macedonia. Now they're thinking to reshape it or to redesign it for a huge, really huge solar power plant, which would then apply for this small co-financing. I believe European Union will be supportive, but that's all. I mean, I'm reading about these plans. I'm not officially informed, so don't take it for granted. But just to summarize, there are interesting projects going on, and I'm sure we will see big developments in the region in next years.
Thank you very much for the detailed answer. That was great. Thank you.
András, would you like to add anything? Or is there any other questions? If there is no, it seems to me, yeah, I just have to check, but it seems to me that there are no other questions at this time. So first of all, as you can see in the chat box, you can already download the whole study if you haven't received it yet from the greenpolicycenter.com. And I would also encourage you to reach out to the addresses I just put in the chat, either to info@greenpolicycenter.com or my email address, in order to make sure that we can send you all the materials, including the presentation from today and the recording of this press conference. And once more, I look around if we have any other questions, but I don't think so. So I would like to ask András to say a few words as a goodbye, and as a question for helping in those last words. I would like to ask a final question. If we can say that, so is it proper to say that one of the fundamental messages of this study is that why we are talking so much about investments and the necessity of fundings for the transition, it's also really, and even we could say equally important, to have a political commitment from those governments in the region, and basically globally from around the world, from all countries, in order to commit to the transition and make the proper legislation for the transition, because without that, no funding can help.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone for coming, and this is a very important message, which I try to underline in my presentation, but yeah, let's reinforce it, that without leadership, and this is the word I would use here, without leadership, no transition will be possible, or at least no controlled transition will be possible. But this leadership needs to include the awareness raising and the involvement of society and the support of society. So it's a back and forth process between political leadership and the society. It needs to affect each other and needs to reinforce each other along the way. But this is a very important underlying message of the study. So thank you very much again for having us. And as Gergely said, the study is already available on our website, the link can be found in the chat box, and we will be happy to answer questions in writing as well in our contact points. Thank you.
Thanks again for coming. See you on our next presentation.
Thank you. Bye.